this morning. We're going to start with a prayer. I've asked Nate, if he would, to lead us in the opening prayer. So if you would, Nate.
Dear God, we come to you this morning. We thank you for this period of Bible study. Be with Brother Dave and each of us. We strive to glean truth and insight from your word. We thank you for all those who are struggling with health and other challenges, and ask you to be with them and continue to bless them. Brother Mac and Brother Jerry Rayville, Sister Debbie with her recent surgery, and others. Father, thank you for all you've given us, and we pray that you be with us through this Bible study this morning. These things we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, thank you. All right, so last week, we finished up chapter 23. We talked about the information that Paul's nephew, his sister's son, gave to him, and then in turn gave to the commander, and the dilemma that it left the commander with. Do I act on it? Do I not act on it? Do I do something else? So we saw what he ended up doing. There we go. Okay, so, and then we talked about those who had vowed to kill Paul, that they wouldn't eat or drink until they had done so, and we talked about their fate. And then, there we go, what Paul's nephew was instructed to do, now that he passed on the information, how he was instructed to keep quiet. And then we talked about how Claudius was going to move Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea to stand in front of Felix, and Felix would then judge the case. So it would be out of Claudius Lysias's hands. So Claudius wrote the letter that went with Paul and those soldiers who accompanied him. They went through Antipatris, they went to Caesarea, and we talked about the factors that Felix had in deciding, well, okay, I'll go ahead and I'll decide this case since it is in my jurisdiction, since Paul is a Roman citizen. And so then this morning, we'll begin with Acts chapter 24. Before we do, I want to ask, does anyone in our assembly this morning, is anyone here a lawyer by trade, an attorney by trade? No. Does anyone in the assembly this morning work for a lawyer or an attorney? Does anyone here work at all in the legal profession? So I can say, oh, you did? Okay, but not presently. Okay, so I can say anything I want about lawyers today and get away with it. That's what I'm assuming. So, because we're going to talk about a lawyer in this morning's class. So anyways, so Paul has been taken into custody. My other question before we actually get into the text, does anybody know how long Paul was in custody? Okay, at least 2 years, because we talk at the end of the chapter, we learn that he's held in Caesarea for 2 years. Is that the full length of his time in custody? It's actually longer. How much longer? How long was he? Well, where did he go from Caesarea? He goes on to the Italian homeland. Okay, Rome. So he goes to Rome. How long is he in Rome? At least another 2 years that we know of. So at least 4 years. This is a long, drawn-out process. It's not like, okay, we'll see one judge this week, we'll see another judge the next week, and then the week after that, we'll be done with it. This was a long, drawn-out process, 4 years. So I want us to begin in chapter 24. Let's read the first 9 verses. If you want to follow along with me, I'll read. Chapter 24, beginning in verse 1, says, Now after 5 days, Ananias, the high priest, came down, talking about coming down from Jerusalem, with the elders and a certain orator named Tertullus. I'm going to pronounce it Tertullus. Tertullus just doesn't sound right. It sounds like you're lacking turtles. Tertullus, we're going to say. These gave evidence to the governor against Paul, the governor being Felix. And when he was called upon, Tertullus began his accusation, saying, Seeing that through you we enjoy great peace, and prosperity is being brought to this nation by your foresight, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear by your courtesy a few words from us. For we have found this man," talking about Paul, "we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple. And we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law, but the commander Lysias came by and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come to you. By examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things of which we accuse him." And the Jews also assented, maintaining that these things were so. So, we get into our questions this morning. So, who traveled to Caesarea to accuse Paul? Chapter 24, verse 1 says what? Ananias, who was the high priest, okay? The high priest, the elders who served as his counselors, okay? And who else? Tertullus, yes. A certain orator. In some versions, it may say lawyer or attorney. The New King James that I've got says orator or orator. So anyways, so the high priest, the elders that worked with him, and the attorney that was going to represent them. Okay? Did they have to go? Did they have to go? If they were going to pursue the matter, they couldn't do it in Jerusalem anymore because Paul had been moved. So if they wanted to pursue it, they had to go to Caesarea. And they choose to. It's not like, well, this was just a small thing. Paul is a major pain in the neck for them. So he's been doing this for quite some time. He's made lots of enemies, including here in Jerusalem. And so they're probably thinking, it's high time we finish this. Let's be done with him. Whatever it takes, if it means going all the way to Caesarea, let's do it. Let's be done with him. Let's get him jailed or killed or out of our hair at least. So they go, but they don't plan, this time, they don't plan any assassination. There may not have been an opportunity for them to make plans for that. So they go and they stand before Felix. Interestingly enough, what were the roles that Felix served in the Roman government? Any ideas? He was going to hear the case, so that would make him a what? A judge, okay? So he served as a judge. What else were his roles? I couldn't hear you. Governor, okay. So he commanded the military, the Roman military that was in the area. And he also, the third thing he did was collect taxes. Of course, government can't exist without taxes, right? Well, those were the three things he did. So he was almost all three branches of what we would call our government, the legislature, the executive branch, the judicial branch. He was almost all three. He didn't make the taxes, but he did collect them. That falls under the executive branch in our government as well. He commanded the military forces. That's an executive function. And he also acted as a judge. So he was both executive and judicial branches in this province. So they bring with them Tertullus. Let's move on to the next screen. Okay, so who was Tertullus? Do we have any information on him other than what's listed here in the scripture? He's described as an orator or a lawyer or an attorney. If you look in the original language, they use the word is spelled R-H-E-T-O-R, and it means a person who uses persuasive language. It's where we get our English word rhetoric. So he was probably someone who was familiar with the Roman law. It might have been that they understood that they needed Felix, the Jews understood that they needed Felix to be on their side. They needed someone to flatter him. But it may have been that it was just too much for them to do that themselves. did the Jews like the Romans? No. The Romans were an occupying force. They ruled by force. They had come in, and not too far in the distant future, they would actually destroy the entire city of Jerusalem. But for now, they ruled by force, so they weren't very popular. So it may have been too far a stretch for Ananias and the other members of the council to say all these flowery words, all these compliments, and all these things that they would need to say in order to get Felix on their side. So what do? They hire an attorney. What do we do today? We hire an attorney. Not necessarily to influence the judge, if the judge is actually the one rendering the verdict, perhaps. But if we're facing a jury, then the judge just oversees the proceedings, makes sure everything is done according to the law, and it's the jury that has to be convinced. In this case, there was no jury. There was just Felix. So, let's see, who was Tertullus? What would he do? He would accuse, he would bring charges against Paul. Even though Lysias had written a letter, said he could find nothing for which Paul was guilty, Felix, though, had said, I'm going to conduct an investigation of my own. And that's when the Jews said, okay, we need to get somebody here to represent us. Yes, Rod. Mm-hmm. Yes. He's done this before, yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He may have been a Roman. There's Tertullus, yeah. Even if their charges were false, it was probably a good move on their part. Right. Okay. So, I've never heard of the word exordium. I've heard of the word exorbitant, and I thought, oh, are they kind of similar? I don't know. But anyways, what kind of exordium did Tertullus give? I had to look up the word exordium, and basically it means an introduction, a preface, a prologue. It's different from what we would call our opening statements in court. The defense would give an opening statement, the prosecution would give an opening statement to the jury, assuming there's a jury, and they would basically outline what they intend to do. No amount of flattery involved in that. Simply stick to the case, stick to to what you're trying to do. So this exordium was different from an opening statement, but there were rules about what you could and couldn't say in this exordium. Cicero describes some of the rules in the things that he wrote. I'm not going to go into all of them, but if you were interested at least enough to look into it, you could look at what Cicero wrote about exordium. So, what kind of administration had Felix had? What kind of a man was Felix? What did we say last week? We talked about Felix. He took bribes. Okay? So he was corrupt. He was also heavy-handed. Now, it's true, he did restore to some degree law and order. There were a lot of folks going around doing things that they shouldn't. He did crack down on that, but he cracked down on it so much so heavy-handed that there were those who were going to reject Roman rule no matter what he did, regardless of how nice he was. There were some, though, who could live with Roman rule, so long as it wasn't too heavy-handed. He went beyond, well, he stepped across the line for some folks, and so even the moderate Jewish folks said, this is too much for us. Even though he's restored order and he's made the place safer for us, he's still too heavy-handed. We remember, I don't think it was last week, but maybe 2 weeks ago, we talked about how he had Jonathan, the high priest, assassinated because Jonathan had challenged Felix to be more worthy of his office. Felix got, I don't know if he was insulted, but he took it kind of personal enough that he had Jonathan assassinated. So it was his corruption and his cruelty in office that finally caused the attitude of rebellion to grow in the hearts of average Jews. So that's the kind of administration that Felix had. Far different from what we see in Acts chapter 24, what Tertullus had to say. Seeing that through you we enjoy great peace and prosperity is being brought into this nation by your foresight, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Very flowery, very flattering, but not exactly the correct picture of what was actually going on. Okay? So, he mentions, I think it's in verse 4, nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear by your courtesy or by your kindness or by your providence a few words from us. Talking about providence, what does providence mean? How do we use the word providence today? Do we use it? Something that was guided, okay, something that had to occur. When I think of providence, I think of providence from who? From God, okay? I think of God's providence. I think there was no way this could have happened unless God had a hand in it, okay? At this time, in the first century, within the Roman government, providence was extended not just to the one true God, not just to the false gods, but it was even extended to the emperor. You think of what providence was described as a divine action. The emperor was considered divine. So they extended this idea of providence from God, from the one true God, all the way down to Caesar. And now, talking about providence, these Jews have hired Tertullus to go so far as to say Felix has taken divine actions in helping the Jewish nation. So anyways, that's what the providence is talking about. So the next question, how did Tertullus address Felix personally? In verse 3, most noble Felix, or most excellent, depends on what version you have. There were possibly some things early in his administration that he had done that were honest, that truly did benefit the Jewish people, but by the end of his reign, and he reigned in Samaria for 4 years, and then he reigned in Judea for another 8 years. 8 years, that's what it was. But by the end of his reign in Judea, he was recalled back to Rome, and he was basically put on trial, and the only thing that spared him from being executed was the influence of his brother. His brother was a counselor to the emperor. So this most excellent, this idea of most noble Felix was overblown by a large margin. The way it's written here, he spoke as if he were obliged, not just obliged to say all these things, but obliged to restrain himself from saying too much. You've done so much for us, Felix, but I don't want to take up all your time, so I've said a few things, so let's actually get on with the actual reason that we're here today. Okay? So, He addresses him as most noble or most excellent Felix. And then he gets into the reason that they're there, talking about Paul. What's the first thing that he says about Paul? He is a most what? He doesn't say most excellent. A plague or a pest or pestilence. When I think of plagues, I think of Egypt. I think of the 10 plagues that God rained down upon them, and none of them were easy. For Tertullus to say this man is a plague, a pestilence to the Jewish nation, it was a personal attack. When do we hear about personal attacks? Election season, okay? We're not in election season here, but he's still using that tactic. Why does that tactic work sometimes? Why do we sometimes have to resort to a personal attack? Because they're losing. Because it instills fear, okay? They possibly weren't sure that they could convince Felix about the other charges. So let's lay the groundwork first. He's a pest. He's a plague to not just to his own people, but to the Roman Empire in general. So he lays that, makes a personal attack first. After he does that, then, the next question is, was this charge really true? He was called a ringleader, yes. He was accused of stirring up the Jews throughout the world, desecrating the temple, being a ringleader. But we're going to see that none of those charges are true. They bring 3 charges against him. The first charge, actually we'll get into that. Oh, I went too far. All right, so the first charge, a disturber of the peace. Ron. Tertullus. He's trying to tear him down just as soon as he gets there. Mm-hmm. Setting the stage. It's kind of like when you're playing a game of chess. Who has the advantage at the beginning of the game? Whoever's playing white, because they make the first move, right? For those of you who play chess. So those who play chess realize you've got the advantage if you make the first move. Tertullus was not about to give up that advantage. He was setting the stage for for the charges that he would bring against Paul. So he brings the first charge, that Paul was a disturber of the peace. Was that true? Okay. How so? Okay, so he challenged, go ahead. Okay, so people did react to what he said. That's true. What was he doing as he went about Asia Minor? Preaching, okay. On his missionary journeys, he was preaching about Christ, about the resurrection. Some people accepted it. Some said, we want to hear some more about it. Some just flat outright said, no, we don't want to hear any more about this. And they even got violent, okay? So I wouldn't say that he disturbed the peace. No, I would say that those who reacted to him disturbed the peace. I don't know if it's semantics, but nonetheless, he was in several incidents where the peace was disturbed. If you go back to Acts chapter 13, all the way back to chapter 13, in Antioch of Pisidia, that was the first recorded one. If you go to Acts chapter 14, he and Silas are in Iconium. They learn that they don't leave town, their lives are in danger because of the way that some folks are reacting. They flee to Lystra, and what happens at Lystra? Paul is stoned. Those who were in Iconium follow him to Lystra. He's stoned. They think he's dead. They've drug him outside the city. He's been stoned, but he's not dead. You go to Acts chapter 17. He's in Thessalonica. In Thessalonica, they assault the house of Jason, hoping to find Paul and those who are traveling with him. No, they don't. So they hold Jason responsible. In Acts chapter 19, in Ephesus, we read how Demetrius, the silversmiths, the silversmiths led the charge against Paul because he was speaking out against Diana, saying that there's only one true God and that Diana is not the one true God. So the silversmiths actually led a full-blown riot. And then in chapter 21, as he is in the temple, he's dragged out of the temple, and he's accused of having brought someone into the temple who was a Gentile, even though he hadn't actually done that, even though he hadn't been preaching. He was simply fulfilling a vow, and he's drug out, and they begin to wail on him. Don't know how close they got to actually beating him to death, but he was in a bad way there. So several times he's been in positions where people have reacted to what he's been doing, and they've had it in for him. That's how he's painted as a disturber of the peace. Was it true that he was an actual disturber? What do we say? The proof is in the pudding. Proof is in the details. Either way, okay? What do we say in our legal system? Innocent until proven guilty, okay? They can say that, yes, he was at all of these events where the peace was disturbed, but was it he who was actually causing the violence? No. The violence was in reaction to what he said, caused by those who disagreed with him. Okay? So, we go on to the second charge, the ringleader. What does it mean to be a ringleader? Okay. Okay. All right. The notes here, this word, ringleader, does not occur anywhere else in the New Testament. It's a military word denoting one who stands first in an army. A standard bearer, a leader, a commander. Paul was pictured as being a leader in a new sect that was spreading. That brings us to our next question. What does the word sect mean? When I look at the word sect, I think of the word section, meaning a portion of. Was this a portion of some other religion, what Paul was preaching? In some instances, he was portrayed as being a heretic from the Jewish religion. In others, he's portrayed as being someone who is starting a brand new religion that's illegal in the Roman government. The original Greek word, I could spell it, but anyways, the translation of that into English means heresy. The original Greek word meant something someone chooses to do or believe. We see back in those days, you could choose to be a Pharisee, you could choose to be a Sadducee, you could choose to be neither. Today, in politics, you've got the Democratic Party, you've got the Republican Party, you've got several other smaller parties that you can be a part of. Those are all sects according to the original definition, something one chooses to do or believe. There were even different schools of thought when it came to medicine. You could follow one I wouldn't say surgeon, one medical practitioner who decided, I'm going to do things this way, or someone else who said, I'm going to do things this way. I see things differently. Anyways, that was one use for the word sect back in Paul's day. Okay. He used this term, a ringleader of the Nazarenes. If you were a Nazarene, how would you feel about that? Someone's going to the governor and saying, this man is a ringleader of the Nazarenes. And if you're from Nazareth, if I was from Nazareth, I'd be tempted to say, don't lump me in with him, or don't lump him in with us, and we don't have anything to do with him, just because we're from Nazareth, don't make that association. If you, someone turn for me to John chapter 1. I want us to read two verses. John chapter 1, verses 45 and 46. Okay, Nate?
Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see."
Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? This was several years before Paul is brought before Felix. So the reputation that Nazareth had even before then was there's not much not much good that's going to come out of Nazareth. So he uses Nazareth, because Jesus came from Nazareth, as a derogatory term. In today's legal terms, what would we call that? When you say something bad about someone. Slander, okay? If you write it, what do you call it? Libel, okay, from a writer. He would know, he's a writer. Okay, so yes, if you write it, it's considered libel. If you say it, it's considered slander. I don't know if the penalties are different, but anyways. If it's true, that's one thing, And then if it's not true, and then if you know it's not true, on top of that, then it's even worse. Okay, so we've talked about the word sect. Let's go on to the third charge, which was that what? It had to do with the temple. To desecrate the temple. Now, what did they say? Let's see, in verse 5, "We have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him." Is that what they said before the Roman commander, Lysias, in Jerusalem? What did they say specifically about the temple? Did he try, or did he actually? What they said before Claudius Lysias was that he actually did profane the temple. Here, before Felix, they walk it back and they say he even tried to, because they know they don't have any what? Proof. Proof would also involve witnesses. They don't have any witnesses. These folks here who are in Caesarea accusing him are not witnesses to what actually happened. You've got Ananias, the high priest. You've got the elders that came with him. They were the ones who Paul was brought to. Those who had actually seen, or supposedly seen, the reason why Paul had been assaulted and dragged out of the temple, they were nowhere to be found. They were still back in Jerusalem. So there were no actual witnesses, eyewitnesses to what Paul had supposedly done. So, what do they say? He tried to desecrate the temple. So did Tertullus, their lawyer, did he mention Trophimus? Who was Trophimus again? He was the Ephesian. He was one of the group that came with Paul from his missionary journeys back to Jerusalem to help deliver the funds that had been collected for the Jews because of the difficulties they were having. He was from Ephesus. He was supposedly the one that had gone into the temple with Paul, but was Trophimus here at the accusation? No. Did he even mention Trophimus? Didn't even mention him. Just said that Paul tried to desecrate the temple. No witnesses, no proof. Okay, so their response to what Paul had supposedly done. We arrested him. Is that true? No, it's not true. There's a difference. If you go back to, Where is it? Where is it? If you go back to chapter 21, where in chapter 21 does it show them trying to arrest him? What was their first reaction? Let's kill him. Okay? So was killing him part of an arrest procedure? No. No. They've made it flowery. They've made it look like, yes, we were going to try him. We arrested him. We were going to try him. We were going to give him a fair trial, but Claudius Lysias took him away from us, even did so violently before we could judge him by our own laws. So you've got Ananias and the elders that went with him being represented by Tertullus saying, we didn't get our fair share, or we didn't get our fair shot at what we should have been allowed to do. Is that how it went down? Not really. No. But that's how they represented it. So he said Tertullus had taken Paul out of their hands by violence and had basically denied them their chance or their shot at justice. Okay? So how did Tertullus make the Jews look? Like they were going to give him a fair trial. That's far and away different from what we actually read in chapter 21. They were perhaps minutes, perhaps even moments away from killing Paul. Okay? So did the Jews join in the accusations? We see at the verse, at the end of this section, and the Jews also assented, maintaining that these things were so. So yes, the Jews fully agreed with what Tertullus was saying. So we go on to, well, actually one more thing I wanted to mention before we go on to the next section. So Claudius Lysias wrote a letter to Felix. And what were some of the things that Claudius Lysias said in that letter? Well, let's go back to the end of chapter 23. There was a cause. Yes, he had to have a letter with him when he's forwarded on to the next court. Beginning in verse 26 of chapter 23. Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. Coming with troops, I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. The part about knowing when he was a Roman, exactly when he knew, that was not correct. But it is true, this man was seized by the Jews. This man was about to be killed by them. I rescued him with troops. What did the Jews say? The Jews said, we arrested him. We were going to give him a fair trial, but Claudius took him away from us. Not true. But the Jews didn't know what was in this letter. They didn't know that Claudius had sent Paul to Caesarea until the next morning. They didn't know that a letter went with Paul from the hand of the Roman commander explaining what really had happened. So Tertullus is projecting the Jews' point of view, but neither Tertullus nor the Jews understand that Felix already has this letter from Claudius Lysias explaining what really happened. So they join in the accusations. It doesn't do them any good because Felix already knows, number one, from the letter that he has from Claudius, what really happened. Number two, this is not his first run-in with Jews. He has been a judge for his time in, not just in Judea, but also the 4 years before that in Samaria. So he knows how the Jews work. He knows how they misrepresent things. He has a first-hand account from his own sources in the area. So even though the Jews joined in the accusations, it didn't do them any good. I do want to read, while we've got time, the next section in the text, beginning in verse 10. I want to read verses 10 through 21, and then we'll probably have to call it quits for today. So beginning in verse 10, it says, Then Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, answered, Inasmuch as I know that you have been for many years a judge of this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself, because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went to Jerusalem to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone, nor inciting the crowd. either in the synagogues or in the city, nor can they prove the things of which they now accuse me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. This being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and men. Now, after many years, I came to bring alms and offerings to my nation, in the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with a mob nor with tumult. They ought to have been here before you to object if they had anything against me. Or else let those who are here themselves say if they found any wrongdoing in me while I stood before the council, unless it were for this one statement which I cried out standing among them concerning the resurrection of the dead. I am judged before you, or I am being judged by you this day. So that's the defense that he gives. Let's see if we've got time. We might have time here. Okay, talking about the three charges. They were that Paul was a disturber of the peace, that he was a ringleader of the Nazarenes, and that he had tried to profane the temple. Were these serious charges? How fond were the Romans of riot, of disorder, tumult? Did they like it? No. They liked a very peaceful, very orderly society, and so any of these charges could have been serious enough to keep Paul in prison for a long time, if not actually have him executed. Paul has to take these charges seriously. So he presents this defense. He says, how did Felix give Paul approval to speak? Either with a motion of his hand or a nod of his head, in some non-verbal way. For some reason, I don't know if there was a rule where he couldn't speak during the proceedings or what. But anyways, he gives Paul the opportunity to speak for himself. Now that Tertullus has had his say and the Jews have made their accusations, now it's Paul's turn to give his defense. That's where we will pick up next Sunday. Any comments or questions?